As I was sitting in an outdoor chapel at a family camp on the coast of Maryland, a young mother and her toddler son walked in. And this chapel was set up on a hill. There was a forest sloping steeply down to the beach, right from the ledge of that rickety wooden gate at the edge of the chapel. And it was a beautiful day. It was all laughter and green grass and wind blowing off the bay and rustling the trees. This was long before the pandemic. And the mother, I'll call her Allison, she walked in holding little Louis, I'll call him Louis's hand. He was a cherubic little boy. He was maybe 3 or 4. He had these astonishingly blue eyes and little golden ringlets bouncing as he pulled his mom around the chapel to look at all the different leaves and rocks that had blown in there. The chapel was one of the only places in this main camp where you could actually see the beach that was down below us. To get to the beach, you had to take a long, winding path that zigzagged through trees and cabins, and most people drove there. It was so long. But if you didn't want to go all the way down, you could stand at the edge of the chapel and look through the trees, through that railing, down below to the bay. And Louis had asked his mom to come here because he wanted to see the beach. So Allison hoisted that little body into her arms and held him up over the railing so he could see over. And he put his little chubby hands on the railing and he looked out. And Allison explained to Louis what he was seeing. Those are trees. And down there is the beach. Do you see the beach? And see those boats floating in the water? And the water moves in waves. And after gazing down at those crashing waves for a while, Louis turned his head and asked his mother, when are they going to stop? And his mom, Allison, paused for a moment, and then she said, they don't ever stop. And his little eyes widened, and he turned his head back down to look at those waves, again, those waves that never stop. And I was preparing to lead worship the next morning, and I looked down at my hymnal, my gray hymnal, and I read a line from the hymn that we had picked for the next morning. I brought my spirit to the sea and gazed upon infinity. Does anyone know that hymn? Gazing upon infinity. I've thought a lot about Louis over the years and the honor of getting to witness what might have been the first moment that he encountered infinity. I wonder what it would be like to have the brain of a 3-year-old again. What it feels like for so much to be unknown or new, so much being learned every day, so many to help you, so many who are ready with answers for your questions. I wonder how the limits of his brain coped with being told that the waves would never end, never. I wonder how hard he tried to understand infinity in that moment, or if watching infinity made him grip the railing more tightly or lean back into the reassuring body of his mother, if witnessing the infinite made him more attached to the concrete realities around him. What I know is that whether we are 3 years old or much, much older, it's impossible to comprehend the limitless. It's impossible to fully comprehend the infinite, right? Each generation's great mathematical minds and maybe their great religious minds also help us move a tiny step closer to understanding. Einstein's theory of relativity bringing one more aspect of the infinite into the realm of our human brains. The Dalai Lama's message of compassion opening new space in the boundless capacity of our human hearts. But even with those great minds, those great hearts, we're never really fully able to understand the infinite. And yet a great deal of humanity spends a lot of time trying to cultivate a sense of intimacy with the infinite, intimacy with the infinite. We cannot ever fully understand it or know it, and yet we yearn to be close to it, to feel connected to it. to feel a part of it, to feel like we are meaningful within the vast, infinite space around us, to feel like we are meaningful in time as history unspools behind us, to feel like we are purposeful as new possibilities bubble up into being ahead of us. Infinity is frightening. It's so massive that we can feel powerless in the face of infinity. It's so huge that we can feel insignificant. It's so incomprehensible that we feel stupid sometimes. But for most people, there's power in cultivating a sense of intimacy with the infinite, because it often means cultivating a relationship with God for people who use that language, or gods, or however one names the holy or the ground of our being. This is the ultimate paradox at the center of many people's faith, that we seek a deeply personal relationship, maybe the most close and personal relationship of one's life, with that which is the most impersonal thing possible, that which holds everything, moon and humanity and stars and oceans, earth, galaxy, tiniest space between individual atoms, largest space between solar systems. We seek closeness with that which is boundless. And the fact that people succeed at this, that millions or maybe billions of people have close and intimate relationships with that which they call God or gods, that which they consider infinite, this is part of what keeps faith alive for us as a humanity. So this is the academic part of the sermon. There is a whole segment of theology, you can study it in seminary, that's called negative theology or apophatic theology. Have you ever heard of apophatic theology before? When I first heard it, I thought that they were saying apathetic theology, which is maybe a regular critique of Unitarian Universalists, that we're just like apathetic about theology. It's a wrong critique of Unitarian Universalism. Apophatic theology describes God only by what God is not. Does that make sense? So the only way that you describe God in apophatic theology is that which God is not. So recognizing that the vast and unbounded nature of the holy can't be adequately captured in human understanding, let alone words, apophatic theologians might only ever describe God as infinite. This was put into words 16 centuries ago by Augustine, si comprehendis non est Deus. If you have understood, then what you have understood is not God. 25 centuries ago, Lao Tzu wrote something similar in the Tao Te Ching, that the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. Any attempt to directly describe God or the infinite will inherently fail, right? This is the whole point of that kind of theology. And to me, apophatic theology, negative theology, is sort of the other side of mysticism. Most people know of mysticism as an area of religion or spirituality that's outside the realm of normalcy. Most of us don't describe ourselves as mystics all the time. Mystics are those people who have direct experiences of the divine, people who find union with that which is holy, people who seek out religious practice that's not based on doctrine or routine or duty, but something more intuitive or more connected, sometimes more ecstatic. Famous mystics are like Saint Francis of Assisi and Hafez and Julian of Norwich and Rumi, Thomas Merton. They're often monastics or Kabbalists or Sufis, teachers in the Hindu, Sikh, or Buddhist or Taoist tradition. In our faith tradition, transcendentalism was the mystical outgrowth of our Unitarian heritage in the early 19th century. But as theologian Catherine Keller writes, mysticism means, as the word maybe hints to us, not primarily special experiences or esoteric gifts. Mysticism is a persistent attunement to the mystery. Mysticism is a persistent attunement to the mystery. It isn't about knowing, is what she's saying. It's not about knowing in our brains. It's about finding comfort, sometimes even radical joy, in the bewilderment and mystery of human experience. Intimacy is ultimately what brings meaning to our lives. Excuse me. All the ways that intimacy shows up for us. Each of us yearns for relationships that feel close, for communities where we know we belong. This is one of those communities, right? Chorale is one of these communities. Communities where we know we belong. We yearn for those places. We yearn for love and affection. We seek the kind of relationships where we can be our true selves, our compassionate and competent selves, those selves that we're proud of, and the selves that fall apart, the selves where we're jealous or petty or selfish. We seek relationships that support us when times get hard and encourage us when times are good. Communities where we're fully welcomed and not judged. These kinds of relationships and communities strengthen our cores and challenge us to be better. They help us to build our resilience and amplify our joy, and they hold us when we cry. Intimacy is what brings meaning to our lives. But intimacy isn't really possible without some kind of visceral connection. We are humans, and we have the need to connect in a human way. And so, when I reflect on this congregation's spiritual theme for the month of renewing faith, I think about renewing that visceral connection that helps us feel intimacy with whatever faith means to us. And I think about that sweet little child in the outdoor chapel. When I gaze upon the ocean's waves, I too am filled with awe. I can't wrap my brain around how large the ocean is. Can any of you? I can't fully understand how complex the ecosystem is underwater. And when the tides are strong or the waves are fierce, the ocean's power can frighten me. And at the same time, when I walk out into calm waters on a summer night and there's phosphorescent algae sparkling around my legs and stars sparkling overhead, I can lie back into that water. I can float, and with my ears underwater and my eyes shut, I can stretch out and feel fully held by the ocean. It can surround me, and it can quiet the harsh world for me. It can lift me. It immerses me in something ancient and yet alive. Many similar words for God. Intimacy with the infinite. I can feel intimate with the ocean, even though it's my limits themselves that help me most understand the ocean's limitlessness. It's the edge of my skin that touches the vastness of the ocean and helps me understand it. It's the feeling of cool water on my skin. It's the muffled waves crashing in my ears. It's the taste of sea salt on my lips. It's the scent of seaweed. Knowing where I end and the water begins and feeling immersed in water, I'm able to feel close to it, even though it is so vast. Knowing that I only know what my body feels, though there is more to know, allows me to be present to mystery. And not all experiences of the infinite are tactile. So over time, I feel like this is part of why humans have come up with other ways to be intimate with the infinite. We've used metaphors and stories. This is where scripture comes from. It helps to give shape to a shapeless infinite so that we can connect to it. It helps us give shape to God, if that's a language we use. That's often why God is pictured as human by so many different human communities, because then we feel like we can have intimacy with God. So maybe we buy a figurine of a meditating Buddha and then we sit in front of Buddha and we imitate his pose to try to deepen our relationship with wisdom. Or maybe we sing of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, 5 times a day to build our own sense of faithfulness. Or maybe we tell stories of Moses to remind ourselves that liberation from oppression is possible where there is courage, where we stick together. Or maybe we look at stained glass images of Jesus cradling a lamb when we need to believe that though we may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, a comforting presence walks beside us. Giving shape to the ineffable gives us a way to connect with it, even when we, like all mystics, know that the ineffable can never be truly captured in any way that our brains can really understand. And it feels important to remind myself also how many of us are reluctant to give any shape to infinity at all because of our religious pasts. I know that when many of us were children, the shape of God that was handed to us was an angry, authoritarian, or abusive man who judged us and found us lacking. That's true especially for us queer folks, right? We were asked to build intimacy with this image of God, and instead we were wounded by this image of God. And like in any hurtful relationship, religious images of a cruel God made it hard for us to trust religious intimacy again, for fear that our wounds might be reopened. Others of us were simply presented with a shape to the holy that didn't align with what our brains told us. It seemed that someone presented us with a metaphor but told us it was the literal truth, and the whole faith felt like a lie. And then there were some of us who were presented with principles devoid of story or metaphor or symbol. And I'm talking about those of us who grew up as Unitarian Universalists with the 7 principles as our core text. Reverend Marlon Lavenhar, my colleague at the All Souls Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, writes, faith and meaning are mediated by metaphors and stories and symbols. Generalized principle statements like our UUA principles lack the power and depth of life's particularities. He says no alcoholic or person on their deathbed or person in need of forgiveness, no grieving parent or child, no person contemplating divorce or suicide or abortion or military service turns to the principles in those times of need or temptation or discernment, because they're not enough to sustain our faith, he says. In my experience, he writes, when I am weeping for my dead daughter, the image of a soiled Mary on her knees, holding her son's lifeless body against her body, touches the core of my experience. And the words justice and compassion for all people are about as inspiring and comforting as a phone book, he writes. Faith and meaning are mediated by metaphors and stories and symbols. All of us, even lifelong UUs like myself and like Marlon, bring religious baggage to the task of renewing our faith. And so if intimacy with the infinite is only possible through tactile connection and metaphors and stories and symbols, how do we find it? I would say that the gift for us in this faith tradition is that we get to choose our way. We get to choose which metaphors and stories and symbols resonate with us as we look to build closeness with the limitless. So if you seek motherly comfort or the power of creation, you might connect with goddess imagery. If you seek connection with the interdependent web of life, you might recognize the sacredness of your cat nuzzling into your hand, or your dog's trusting sleepy head on your lap. If your faith is earth-centered, you may interpret the wind blowing through your hair as the caress of a kind father. And this morning, actually, when I have a baby, and when I woke up early and nursed him and then brought him into his papa, my partner, who has sleep apnea and uses a CPAP machine. And I lay this baby down next to the CPAP machine, which those of you who've ever spent time with one or in bed with somebody with one know that it's like a fan that blows out of their face. This felt even more appropriate to me. I feel like my child is always going to experience the wind as like a holy caress of his kind papa because of the baby the baby relationship with the CPAP machine. I know that the first time that I was able to give voice to the experience of intimacy with the infinite, I was in Turkey with some classmates of mine from seminary. We had traveled there to visit ancient religious sites and learn about Christianity and Judaism and Islam as part of the world, but we went there primarily to celebrate the Sheb Yarus of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. Most of us know him simply as Rumi, the poet and religious leader. Every year on the anniversary of his death, thousands of Sufi Muslim pilgrims flock to Konya, where he lived and where he is buried, to honor his life with ritual and celebration. And Sheb Yarus means wedding day. Actually, it doesn't mean death day, because in the Sufi tradition, one's death is called a wedding. Sufis consider death to be a reuniting with the beloved, with the divine. And I think before I went there, I had never really thought about God as a lover before. And yet there I was, morning, afternoon, and night, praying and chanting and meditating and whirling to celebrate the prophet's wedding to God and to seek a closer relationship with the beloved myself. It was a particularly hard time in my life. I had just gone through a breakup and moved to a new city, and when I entered Turkey, I entered brokenhearted. I wondered if the loneliness of being single would ever cease. I felt purposeless, and I was devastated at the loss of love, and I frankly resented my calling to ministry that had caused me to leave that relationship and that had caused me to go to Turkey. But as we joined together in prayer again and again and again, using this metaphor of uniting with the beloved, as the week went on, my imagination opened. And so I asked myself, if I yearn to increase my sense of interdependence with all that is, why not give a lover's shape to the infinite for a little while and try that on? What would God be like as the beloved? I began to imagine God as a constant presence who would support me when I felt down, who would warm me when I was cold, who would dance with me when I was happy. I imagined God as a lover who thinks that I'm beautiful all the time, and I began to walk around Turkey feeling adored. I imagined God as a partner who stood by me even when I was not easy to be around, and I found myself more able to speak difficult truths even if someone else found them hard to hear. I felt the beloved's warmth in the hugs of friends and in my thick coat that I wrapped around me on those warm, smoky nights. If I felt awkward or alone, I reconnected to the image of the beloved and found good company that found my awkwardness kind of charming, the way a good lover does. Rather than fear the infinite taking the shape of meaninglessness and despair, I began to let the infinite take the shape of love, and I immersed myself in that radiance. Friends, as long as we bring what is true in us to the world, as long as we bring an openness to what arises, we can find meaning in anything. We can choose our metaphors and our stories and our symbols. We can find intimacy with that which is infinite. The way we find meaning can only, however, be determined by examining our own hearts. Little Louis that day in the outdoor chapel found infinity in the waves overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. But I think for him, the scary vastness of the infinite waves only became clear when he was safely snuggled in his mother's arms. So may each one of us discover waves of new experiences that never end. May each one of us be cradled in the arms of love. May it be so, and amen.